And this story as well, which has disturbed many people I know. Serial killer Levi Bellfield is engaged and has applied to marry in prison, according to the Ministry of Justice. The 53-year-old will need the permission of the governor at HM Prison Franklin in County Durham. He's serving 2 whole-life sentences for the murders of Marsha MacDonald, Amalie Dallengrange and Millie Dowler. Prisons Minister Victoria Atkins has ordered an immediate review into Bellfield's request, calling it absolutely appalling. Chris Daw QC is a lawyer, author and broadcaster who joins us now. Chris, afternoon to you. Wouldn't be the first time somebody has got married while they're in prison, but it's always a rather uncomfortable look when it's a serial killer of young women. Then you can understand why some people have a problem with this.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I first heard this story, the thing that really strikes me is the worry that I would have about the safety and indeed the mental health of the woman involved, because as I understand it, she wrote to Levi Bellfield, who is probably one of the most disgusting individuals in our prison system and our prison estate, in almost every single way, in terms of the crimes he's committed and in terms of his complete lack of remorse or understanding for what he's done. And you have to ask yourself, don't you, what sort of a woman would really want to engage in correspondence with him, still let alone marry him? And I just wonder whether thought has been given to her mental health, to her psychological issues that she may be suffering from, and her own welfare. And I honestly don't think, unless those things have been given very careful consideration, that this should be allowed to happen.
Indeed, and in terms of the wider issue of prisoners getting married, I mean, some people would not unreasonably say, Chris, I mean, it's a kind of a strange thing. I mean, you've gone to prison to have your freedoms forfeited. So the idea that you can get hitched while you're spending a decade or two on C Wing does seem to go against what many people would consider to be the purpose of prison.
No, well, I don't agree with that. I mean, prison and the right to marry in prison is kind of enshrined in many jurisdictions. I mean, even in the US, which has an incredibly draconian criminal justice system, you know, people on death row are allowed to marry before they're executed. And I don't think cutting off that sort of basic human right as part of the sentence is necessary or achieves very much. I mean, one of the problems, Ian, and you and I have discussed it on your show many times, that we have in our criminal justice system and in our prison system, is that we kind of dehumanize people who are in prison. And if you do that to the nth degree, and you deprive them of absolutely everything that is kind of considered to be acceptable and normal in everyday life, you know, you just end up with completely different, almost like a completely different subspecies in the mind of the public.
You say that like it's a bad thing, right? I mean, this is clearly we're dealing with horrible people who've done terrible, macabre things, child killers, serial killers, killers of women. I mean, these people are already dehumanized, right? They've dehumanized themselves by their actions. And you want to organise a fancy wedding for them, Chris?
No, I don't want to organise a fancy wedding for me, and you know I don't, and I love how you slip that one in. But I don't want a fancy wedding. No one's suggesting they're going to have champagne and big cakes and sort of, you know, go on a honeymoon to the Maldives or something. I mean, the truth of it is that this would be a pretty miserable affair, you know, half an hour or so out of the cell, no physical contact. And then back to the cell for the rest of his life. I mean, the whole thing is a bit tawdry and miserable and sad when you really think about it.
But I'm still struggling as to why the right to... I mean, I know there are some prison systems, I think Scandinavia, perhaps you can correct me, where they go a little further, where you have certain physical rights when you're serving time on the inside. Most... I'd like to say right-minded people, Chris, would just think that getting married, you talked about breaching human rights. Does anybody give a fig about the human rights of a serial killer?
Yeah, but that's the problem, you see. Human rights are universal. That's the point of them. And if you say that certain rights just you can be deprived of them, we already deprive people. I mean, this man's never going to see the light of day. He's going to be in a prison cell until he dies. He's serving 3 whole life sentences. So he's already being deprived of 99% of the rights that you and I have, and that's for very good reason, because he's an incredibly dangerous individual who plainly could never be allowed to walk the streets again, or at least until he was in a...
But you think it's okay to have a celebratory moment, despite the terrible things he's done? That's still all right by you?
I don't think it's very celebratory. As I say, I think the whole thing is going to be miserable. Can you imagine it? I mean, he's probably going to be handcuffed, or at the very least he's going to be kept a physical distance from the person that he's marrying. He's never going to be allowed any form of physical contact with her for as long as he lives.
Well, which just makes a mockery of the whole thing, doesn't it? It just proves the futility of this idea of advocating that it could ever be okay to get hitched in prison.
Yeah, but people...
It's a nonsense, Chris. Come on, you know this.
I don't think it's a nonsense. I think there are... I think... if people can get married the day before they're executed, as does happen in the United States...
Well, that's just a waste of money, right?
Well, it's not. It doesn't cost anything. I mean, there's no cost involved, really. And indeed, the regulations under the prison rules say that if you are applying to get married in prison, you have to pay for it yourself. Or any costs have to be borne by the prisoner or the intended spouse. So there's no cost to the taxpayer from all of this. As I say, my bigger concern is actually just that this poor woman, what on earth could be in her head?
Yeah, I think we all share that. This is clearly a very dysfunctional situation, and one does wonder about the kind of the mental health of the woman concerned. Am I right in saying, Chris, would it be the governor of the prison that would have to grant permission for this to be the case?
Yes, the governor has to grant permission, and he can refuse permission based on a number of grounds, including if there's a potential collusion with the spouse for the commission of crime and the various other sort of protection factors. And if the governor does permit the marriage to take place, that could be challenged in court. It could be challenged by the government. It could be challenged by members of the public who may be dissatisfied in a judicial review. I have to say, I just think it's sad that we're talking about this man, really. I mean, don't you think? I mean, it must be awful for the families of those that he killed.
Well, that's why that part of the human rights thing surely cannot cover the right to get married, because regardless of, even if it's somebody the prisoner has known for some time and they've been a long-standing partner in their life, the idea that the families, the victims' families, have to hear the news that the person that murdered their spouse, their son, their daughter, mother, father, that they're getting married is just a horrendous look. It's another kick for the victims' families, surely.
Yeah, but that's an argument for not publicising it and keeping it private as much as anything. I mean, let's be honest, Ian, the reason we're talking about it is because there's an element of sort of public interest in these things, and people have sort of an interest in kind of just these sordid individuals who have done these terrible things. And, it's newsworthy. People find it interesting. And, we see that horrible picture of his face, which just comes up time and time again whenever this story is or any story about him and his crime gets into the public attention. And as I say, I think really we should be focusing more on thinking about what's best for the victims' families rather than arguing about the Human Rights Act. I mean, I don't think this is a very good case to use an example for human rights law reform. You can always pick the most extreme cases and then try and use them to form policy, but that's not really how it works. I mean, we don't have torture for anyone. We don't have the death penalty for anyone in this country or anywhere in Europe. And there's a reason for that, because human rights are universal, and certain rights, for example, the very basic right to form some sort of attachment with another human being, however minimal it might be, I think it is a universal right. And I think the saddest thing of all here is that this horrible person is getting yet more publicity, which I'm sure he's enjoying, and I'm sure that the victims are finding utterly traumatic.
I'm sure that's true. Chris, thank you. Chris Daw QC.